the IDSA both for their hospitality and for dedicating this forum to the important issues of non-traditional security. I come to you from Singapore, from the Center of Non-Traditional Security Studies at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And I, like many of you, am very much looking forward to many of the presentations we're going to see over the next 2.5 days about the specifics of non-traditional security issues, particularly here in Asia, and taking a fine-grained look at what many of those challenges will entail moving forward into the 21st century. This is very much in the vein of a lot of our work at the Center for NTS Studies in Singapore, and we attempt to do in-depth research on these specific cases of non-traditional issues throughout the Asia-Pacific. That being said, in my talk here today, I'm going to largely leave that to the forthcoming speakers and try to take up the challenge placed to me by the conveners of the ASC to discuss some of the conceptual and practical challenges that come with placing many of these issues under the rubric of security. And so I want to organize my brief comments this morning along a series of questions that I hope will inform some of the more detailed analyses and more specific analyses from our very well qualified forthcoming speakers. So I'll begin at the beginning. What is security? And security is a word and a concept that I think we can all agree means many things to many people. I'll take time for a quick anecdote here. As I was coming through the very, very efficient Delhi airport in the wee hours, 3 in the morning, I think, on our inbound flight, I was asked at customs if I was a police officer. And I thought, well, this sort of took me aback, given my unkempt appearance and the fact that I've never really been asked if I was a police officer before. But of course, it was because my visa said that I was going to a security conference, and this particular customs agent associated security with police work, understandably so. And I said, no, it's not quite that kind of security. And we both stared at each other, and he decided I was more trouble than I was worth, and gave me my stamp, and I passed on. But I think that this is somewhat of an illuminating story, and for those of us who work in non-traditional security, I think that we all sometimes face challenges in explaining what we do and what NTS really means. Defining yourself by what you're not, the very term non-traditional security, can be kind of a tricky one, I think, for many people and institutions and governments and different actors in the international system to wrap their heads around, and probably are going to come from that from a very different angle. So in asking what is security, I will try to briefly go over the expansionary period of security studies after the end of the Cold War, and then try to trace some of the quotes and the statements from important actors moving forward to the point where we are now, which is closer to an institutionalization of non-traditional security and a real movement up the policy echelon into sort of a higher realm of discourse. I'll then ask security for whom? It's clear from our morning keynote addresses, as well as from my preceding speaker, Admiral Morsetti, that we're not just talking about states anymore, that there are many more actors and stakeholders that are coming into the discussion of security. But this is not a simple or easy distinction to make, and I think that there are some pressing issues on talking about who or what we're securitizing that actually continue to need more analysis even today. Does securitization add value? What, by putting these environmental, climatic, food, energy, development issues under the security rubric, what is that doing that's beneficial for us? And how is this going to be a key towards moving forward to some positive outcome on these issues? Who securitizes? Who has the power and the impetus to place these different issues under this sector of security? Why are they doing so? What are their intentions? And again, does that add value? And finally, what are some of the primary 21st century NTS challenges? And does NTS provide an effective avenue for addressing them? That will likely be a fairly brief conclusion. So looking again at some of the statements as we see the traditional paradigm of security expanding and deepening towards being more inclusive, we see that traditional security was dominated in the 20th century by discussions of force capabilities, deployments, balances of military power, alliances and adversarial management, great power rivalries, nuclear weapons, and so forth. Perhaps very understandable given the security context of the time. We see some of the scholarly language in the mid-1990s referring to this period of Cold War security studies, talking about it in the context of a focus on threat manipulation and force projections, which were central, almost exclusive concerns of security studies. Dalby, following on from Coldzage, says that security in the Cold War was understood in terms of external threats coming from someplace beyond the sphere of domestic political action and control. The response to these external threats was military force applied to counter the threat. And I think that second point is particularly salient for our conversation here, in that it's clear and unambiguous focus on the international, whereas when we see the deepening of security studies, it very much brings the domestic more into the conversation. After the Cold War falls, we see a period of reevaluation. And importantly, this is not just among NGOs or people on the left wing, if there is such a thing, of the academic discourse, but rather coming from traditional security thinkers, if we could still use that term. Admiral Morsetti asked, "I'm a traditional security man. Why am I here talking about NTS?" We see the NATO Secretary General Werner in 1991 say that the immense conflict building up in the third world, characterized by growing wealth differentials and exploding demography, climate shifts, and the prospects of environmental disaster, combined with resource conflicts, cannot be left out of our security calculations. The IISS in London also moved from a very traditional approach to security that focused on the influence of modern and nuclear weapons on warfare, problems of strategy, defense, disarmament, and international relations, to an encompassing area including any major security issues, including, without limitation, those of political, strategic, economic, social, and ecological nature. Through both of these, although they are widening the security conversation, you'll see that the focus remains on stability. How might issues of environmental stress, of resource depletion or degradation, of demographic shifts affect the security landscape in a traditional sense? How might it foment conflict? How might it lead to greater instability? There was a school coming forth at a similar point in time, however, that said that very question was the wrong question to be asking, that this shouldn't all be dealing just with stability, and that's actually just putting NTS issues within a traditional security framework. And this was the idea of human security that was proffered by the UNDP in the early 1990s, also in the wake of the end of the Cold War, which fundamentally question what are we trying to secure? And if we're continually trying to secure states and state interests, that even if we broaden security studies to include new sectors, we're not really addressing the core of the problem. And their response to that was the concept of human security. It challenges traditional notions of the referent object, that is, who or what is being secured, and says that humans are actually what should fill that gap. I think it very eloquently stated in '94 that the concept of security has for too long been interpreted narrowly as security of territory from external aggression, or as protection of national interests in foreign policy. Forgotten were the legitimate concerns of ordinary people who sought security in their daily lives. For many of them, security symbolized protection from the threat of disease, hunger, unemployment, crime, social conflict, political repression, and environmental hazards. The UNDP went further to suggest that these threats to human security did not arise simply from international sources, but rather from domestic sources in many cases, including their own state. And you'll see some images here on your left from Syria very recently, and on your right from the Saffron Revolution in Myanmar in 2007, as both being examples of what the UNDP concept would consider the persecution of human security on behalf of the state that's charged to protect it. Human security divided up its different sectors to be very encompassing, include economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political issues, and in doing so set forth a very comprehensive agenda for what would be included from their advocacy perspective in the security conversation. But is this really a valuable way to move forward? And that is an open question here still today, almost 20 years after the human security concept and the wider broadening of security studies was brought up. And there are some important critiques that I think those of us working on NTS issues need to continue to grapple with when trying to move NTS into a more mature place analytically and practically. Some suggest that by opening up security studies to all of these different sectors and all of these different issues, you're diluting it, and you're reducing its analytical coherence. Prominent scholar from Harvard in the United States, Stephen Walt, says security is the study of threat, use and control of military force. It is concerned with the conditions that make force more likely, the ways the use of force affects individuals, states, and societies, and the policies states adopt in order to prepare for, prevent, and engage in war. Walt says that all these issues being discussed under the rubric of security through the UNDP are quite important, but they're just not security. Paris, in an echo of this to a certain extent, but dealing with human security specifically, says that if it means almost anything, then it means effectively nothing. And he questions the practical application of any concept that's so broad for use for policymakers, which intrinsically divide these issues among different ministries and among different sets of bureaucracy. And so again, what does this combination and comprehensive approach really bring? And this leads to questions: is there a middle ground, perhaps between these polemics of human and traditional security? And I would suggest that NTS and its precursors, such as comprehensive security, are attempting to find that middle ground. And that is, in fact, one of the primary goals here of forums such as this. We see a couple of more quotes, and I promise these will become less frequent in the next concluding part of my presentation. Security studies should not be narrowly restricted to states and questions of military security only, but should be broadened so much that it comes to encompass all issues relating directly or indirectly to violence between individuals and collectives. Broader security studies can add to the traditional analysis of national security if actors and issues its studies have some demonstrable links to states and questions of military importance. CSCAP, a body a council dealing with security affairs here in the Asia Pacific, says something similar and puts forth that the real difference here is that we're not simply talking about states, but also talking about community and individuals going forward. So even if we accept this idea that these different issues, because of their potential effects on stability and well-being of individuals, states, communities, etc., does give them legitimate reason to be under the security rubric, we still have to ask how they arrived there and what the intentions of those who placed them and who securitized them were. We see many people securitizing different issues with many different intentions and impetuses: governments, political elites, military and civil society actors, to be just a few. The concept, or I suppose the impetus again, is typically to bring more attention and resources to a particular issue. By using the term security, you denote something of an emergency type situation. And through this emergency type situation, you can employ new decision-making processes, you can expedite some of the processes that do exist, and you can bring more resources and attention to bear. This can be both a positive and a negative thing. A positive when it does grant the attention that many of these important issues we'll be discussing over the next 2.5 days necessitate. A negative thing when these agendas are co-opted by bureaucracies or sections of government with special interests, competitive interests with those that they might come into contact with through their own internal structures. And this would be a risk of securitization. Another risk of securitization, I would suggest, is that you at times have the propensity to look at those who are most vulnerable to things such as climatic changes, environmental stresses, migration, development deficits, etc., as sources of threat, as opposed to being the actual objects that need to gain the attention of securitization. We see this a lot in the climate and environmental discourse, in which migration is painted as this great cause of instability potentially in the future. And while that's not necessarily incorrect, case-by-case studies need to be engaged with on that sort of subject to ensure that we're not looking at the most least fortunate as a source of conflict and of problems for ourselves, rather as the source or need of attention and resources from the international community and assistance. I'm quickly running over my time, so I think that I'll skip these last points and conclude. This simply reiterates some of what Admiral Morsetti has already talked about, which is that we do have a confluence of different factors, and things like climate and environmental stress have the capacity to exacerbate many existing social tensions and challenges, and in doing so we'll have problems that are greater than the sum of their parts, and that these sorts of problems can erode the capacities of states and communities and political institutions to deal with them at the very time at which the problems themselves are becoming more pronounced. So to try to leave off with a few conclusions and thoughts that I hope might underwrite some of our future conversations, contemporary trends and challenges in these sectors, such as food, environmental, energy, development, and others under the NTS umbrella, are pronounced and do need policy prioritization. A securitization as a concept provides one avenue for such policy prioritizations, but concurrently presents a host of analytical and practical challenges. Further discussions are needed to explore whether NTS is concerned with issues for the sake of them, i.e. in the human security rubric, in which deficits in health, access to key environmental resources are a problem for security in their own right? Or are we talking about the fact that these problems can lead to grievances which ultimately foment instability and potential conflict moving forward? These challenges should not be shirked or oversimplified, and we should not banter the term non-traditional security around such that we can talk about anything that we want. Rather, we should explicitly tackle these questions and criticisms of security expansion to allow the area to reach its full maturity. Thank you very much.